Camp Adjutant will lead us, George Burkett will lead us in the pledges to the flag. George?
U.S. flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Georgia flag. I pledge
Allegiance to the Georgia state flag, the principles for which it stands, wisdom, justice, and moderation.
Let's salute the Confederate flag.
I salute the Confederate flag with affection, reverence, and undying devotion to the cause for which it stands.
Thank you. Well, we're glad that you're all here today. This is the first Polk Memorial Service we've had since the advent of the Chinese coronavirus. And so we're happy to have anybody show up today. And, in fact, one of our compatriots told me just a few moments ago that he's just recovered from COVID for the second time. So I don't know how you want to handle yourself, but if somebody doesn't want to touch you or anything like that, they may have a good reason. So
I'm good now.
Oh yes, but you could get it a third time apparently. At any rate, thank you all for coming here today. Gary Daniel would be ordinarily presiding. Since Gary is not with us today, that is good in one respect. We'll be doing things a little quicker and swifter, but also a little bit more disordered. So I'm going to video this, so I'm going to get Commander Tim Pilgrim to start the video camera and show him what needs to be done, and then we will actually kick off. So here's what you do, Tim.
All right.
Turn it on here. See this red button here?
Yeah.
That's the on-off switch.
Okay, I got you.
It goes for 29 minutes. In the top over there, there's a little, see when you start the thing here, you can see there's a little deal there. It shows you the thing, 29 minutes, 59 seconds.
Yes, sir.
So in about 28 minutes or so, wave to me, and then I'll stop talking, hit the red button, then wait a second or two, then hit it again, and that's it. That's
Okay.
all you need to do.
I got you.
Fairly
You got to sit where you want it, Martin?
I do. All good.
If you need any help, I can help you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Martin O'Toole. We got the red button hit? All right. My name is Martin O'Toole. I'm the spokesman for the Georgia Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Due to the tyranny of our division commander, who insisted he wanted work out of me. So it's a wonderful job. You get to meet all kinds of interesting people and get to talk to the news media, which in and of itself is, of course, always interesting. But we're here today to talk and remember the life and legacy of the Bishop General Leonidas Polk. 158 years ago and 4 days ago, on this very spot where this obelisk stands, one of the most beloved figures of the South was killed under the direction, the personal order of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, who ordered an Indiana battery to open fire on the, quote, saucy rebels that were standing up on the ridge. Now, it may be difficult with the growth of trees we have here today, but this, at the time of the war, was an open area, and it was easily seen from the ground where the Indiana battery was.
It's recording.
Now, we're not so far removed from the past, nor has the human condition changed so much since our nation's founding, that it doesn't provide a useful lamp under our feet today. Remembering the past is insufficient. If that's all we need to do, then a comic book would suffice.
Okay.
We also need to learn from the past and take those lessons and apply them to our daily lives. Through the life of Leonidas Polk, we can recall the struggles and sacrifices of the soldiers and civilians of the Southland during their unfortunate war for independence. Leonidas was descended from Revolutionary War patriots and generals. His grandfather, Thomas Polk, helped draft and publicly read the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence in Charlotte, the first secession of British colonists from the mother country in 1775. A full year before the Declaration was promulgated in Philadelphia. Thomas Polk led North Carolinians to serve under Washington, and he himself was at several major battles and endured that bitter winter at Valley Forge. He was charged at one time with the custody and protection of the Liberty Bell when it was removed from Philadelphia. For all his troubles, Lord Cornwallis, when he was down in North Carolina, occupied Polk's home in Charlotte and reported it was the only painted house in Charlotte. After the reversal of British fortunes at Kings Mountain, Polk gleefully wrote to the Board of War, quote, "I have the pleasure to inform you that on Saturday last, the noted Colonel Ferguson and 150 men fell at Kings Mountain. 800 were taken prisoner and a 1,500 stand of arms. A glorious affair. In a few days we will be in Charlotte, and I will take possession of my house, and his lordship will take to the woods," unquote. The future Bishop General's father, William Polk, was also a Revolutionary War officer, rising to lieutenant colonel and serving under Washington. He was seriously wounded on 2 occasions. Like his father, he was at Valley Forge in that horrible winter. And then when his unit was so depleted that he was returned back home to try to raise more troops. While in North Carolina, he made the acquaintance of a man who became a lifelong friend by the name of Andrew Jackson. He also campaigned with another cavalry officer, Colonel Wade Hampton, whose grandson bore the same name with honor and distinction during the War for Southern Independence. After the war, Thomas Polk served in North Carolina State Legislature, took federal appointments under Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. He served as Surveyor General for North Carolina, and he advised property acquisitions for his friend Andrew Jackson, as well as the father of James K. Polk and the father of Andrew Johnson. So Tennessee's 3 presidents all came to that state from North Carolina due to the agency of the Polk family. Importance was assigned to genealogy when I was a child. I didn't understand why, but as I get older I find that these traditions and these important things about our ancestors help form who we are and also give us guidance as what we can do and what is possible for us to do. A new revolution, a new American revolution in 1861 was well within the mental capacities of a patriot grandson and son of officers who survived the American Revolution, Valley Forge, Cornwallis, and Tarleton. What's significant about Leonidas Polk's father and grandfather was they were prepared to make sacrifices and did not shirk from even revolution in order to achieve liberty. The lessons of their lives would not be lost on their descendant. Polk was born April 10, 1806 in Raleigh, North Carolina. He first attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill before he transferred to the United States Military Academy at West Point. At West Point, Polk experienced a religious conversion, said to be the first ever recorded at that institution in 1826. I haven't heard of any recorded since then. Apparently West Point is not a real great evangelical center for some reason or another. But Polk was the evangelized. As a result, he chose not to pursue a military career. He was graduated in 1827 as 8th of a 38 cadet class and commissioned as 2nd lieutenant of artillery. He resigned his commission on December 1st of that same year to enter seminary, much to the disgust of his rather less than religious and very military-minded father, who thought his son should follow a career in the armed services. While he was at the United States Military Academy, he was noticed and admired by an underclassman by the name of Robert Edward Lee. Next in Polk's life path was his marriage. He married Frances Ann Devereaux, who was the granddaughter of the famous Puritan theologian Jonathan Edwards. They were blessed with 8 children. The Polks then moved to Maury County, Tennessee, where Polk became the largest slaveholder in that county. By 1850, it was estimated he may have owned as many as 400 slaves. This would be significant in his later life. Polk attended a meeting of the American Colonization Society and was favorably impressed with the concept of emancipation, followed by the repatriation of slaves back to Africa, a common solution in the antebellum days. Henry Clay was the speaker at that meeting, and Polk wrote at the time, quote, "All that is wanting to remove not only the blacks that are free, but those that are enslaved also is the consent of the owners and funds to transport them," unquote. He foresaw an ultimate end to slavery. Quote, "In the course of not many years, one state after another will be willing to abolish slavery." Now it must be said, of course, that Polk did not free his slaves. He did not donate or join the society. He was simply impressed by their arguments. But that was a whole scheme of things that people at the time, antebellum America, were trying to deal with. What to do in an independent republic where we had valued liberty and yet we were a slave-holding republic. No one, to my knowledge, ever presented a workable solution to this problem. So for us to criticize people who were alive at that time and tell them, for example, they should have turned loose 400 slaves in Polk's case at no compensation or anything like that, turned them loose on society with no education, no background or anything like that, seems to me a little arrogant in our days today. When touring Europe, Polk was favorably impressed with the European farmer's life as compared to the American plantation system. So Polk did see blacks as humans and worked diligently to include them in his church and evangelize them. He thought they had souls that were worthy of salvation, and he set much of his effort up to the time of his death with evangelizing among blacks and making them into good Christians. He never worked them on Sundays so they could attend services. After Polk's death, at his funeral, the Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia praised Polk for, quote, speaking boldly and fearlessly to fellow slaveholders about their duty to their slaves and for being a living example of that Christian obligation, unquote. Elliott and many others admired Polk for trying to build a biracial, albeit paternalistic, Christian society. Under normal circumstances, parents do not hate their children, but try to provide for them and improve their lot. I think this could be accurately said to be the attitude of Leonidas Polk. He did not see blacks as being equal, but he saw them as more like children that needed his help and needed his support. And that's the way he ran his church, and that's the way he ran his plantation. Polk next became the missionary bishop of the Southwest, a vast territory reported to be larger in acreage than the entire nation of France, in September of 1838. He then became bishop of Louisiana in 1841. So if we just study his career prior to the war, we find an interesting pattern. Polk was more than a churchman. He was also an educational advocate, wanting to improve the world and everyone around him. He sought to found an institution of higher education and create an endowment for what would eventually become the University of the South at Sewanee. And he wanted that institution to be second to none. At the time, the young men of the South, in order to get a first-class education, were sent either north or out of the country. Polk, along with others such as famed Georgian Thomas R.R. Cobb, feared that this meant that the future of the South was dependent on educators who were often hostile to the values of Dixie. Their sons were being shipped off and indoctrinated in doctrines that were religiously or socially incompatible. Is there a lesson for anybody here? As a point of interest, the endowment he sought would have provided the University of the South with an annual income of approximately $200,000. As a point of comparison, the University of Virginia had an annual income of $15,000. The University of Georgia had $6,000. He sought to bring the best scholars in science, the fine arts, and literature to Sewanee to teach at the University of the South. He didn't intend for the South to outshine the North. He intended for the South to outshine the entire world. The University of the South, Polk felt, could compare or exceed Oxford or Cambridge in England. By 1859, he'd raised enough to about equal the income of the University of Georgia and the University of Virginia combined. And he playfully wrote to a close friend, quote, "We have concluded to be done with those Yankee boys altogether," unquote. Consider the difference. If the war had not come and Polk had been successful, as well as Cobb and other Southerners who had visionary dreams, we would see that the poverty that bedeviled the South following the war would not have been the lot of our people. Add solid science, literature, and fine arts, the Southland could have been the shining star around the planet for education. In some respects, it might certainly be said that Polk was a forerunner of local control of education and even homeschooling. When the war approached, the Polk families touched a way that many of you may not be aware. It certainly doesn't get mentioned very often. Bishop Polk indicated the new Southern nation should have a Southern church, and he began to separate the Episcopal Church of the South from that of the North. That was controversial, as the cant expression goes. In the spring of 1861, Mrs. Polk, as well as the bishop's daughters, came to Sewanee and were staying in a house there. That night, an arsonist attempted to incinerate them in their home. Additionally, at the same time, the home of Georgia's Bishop Stephen Elliott was also torched. If it hadn't been for the action of a family, quote, servant, unquote, yes, a slave, Mrs. Polk and her daughters would have certainly died in flames, as would Bishop Elliott. We hear a great deal about Preston Brooks being beaten by Charles Sumner, but have any of you ever heard about the attempted murder of the Polk family or of the attempted arson of Bishop Stephen Elliott's house? It was widely believed they were abolitionists. This did nothing to ensure or discourage the bishop from withdrawing and becoming a bishop general. In fact, when Northerners condemned him for drawing the sword, Polk responded he was like a man who left his business, the church, to help put out a fire at his home, the South. I think this sounds like a not very veiled response to the abolitionist arsonists. In the criticism of Polk, I've never heard mention some of the outstanding bishops and archbishops who took up arms in the past. These would include a papal legate, Abner Moore of Monteil, who remained Bishop of Lisieux while serving the First Crusade. He was viewed as the most competent general in the First Crusade. Bishop Odo of Bayeux was fought in armor at the Battle of Hastings. Archbishop Turpin of Reims fell at the side of Roland, which generated the famous Song of Roland. European history is replete with stories of the valor of Christian knights in military orders such as the Knights Templars and the Knights Hospitaller. Christ's interesting admonition in Luke 22:36 that, quote, "He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one," unquote, is never mentioned in the context of Bishop Polk's military service. Thus, when secession came, Polk led the Louisiana Convention of the Protestant Episcopal Church out of the United States Protestant Episcopal Church. And he viewed it as creation of a new nation, the Southern Confederacy. The Episcopal Church needed to redeem itself, just as the Episcopal Church had separated from the Anglican Church following the American Revolution. All bishops agreed, North and South, there was no episcopal or ecumenical or theological division between the sections. And he suggested that friendly Christian communion in the United States would continue. However, some of the differences would be prayers offered up would now reflect the new realities of an independent Southland. Immediately, the prayers offered up in the Diocese of Louisiana made reference to the governor of Louisiana and the state legislature as compared to the President of the United States and the United States Congress. An example of the ecclesiastical correspondence Bishop Polk had with the Episcopal Bishop of New York, he was writing, and the bishop said, "I was shocked at the delight expressed by Northern abolitionists as to the rupture between the regions. Bishop Potter was opposed to the use of force by the North but hoped for reconciliation. Bishop Hopkins of Vermont concluded that he recognized the South had as much right to secede as the 13 colonies had to throw off the English rule. He merely questioned the wisdom of the act, not the right to secede. He said that the election of Lincoln was not sufficient to endanger the constitutional rights of the American people." Polk called upon the bishops of the Confederate States to participate in a convention in Montgomery on July 3, 1861, for the purpose of consulting, quote, "upon such matters of interest to the Church as have arisen out of the changes in our civil affairs, and with a view of securing uniformity and harmony of action," unquote. Jefferson Davis now, he knew and admired Polk from his West Point days, but despite what many might think, the two did not keep in close connection over the years. How then did Leonidas Polk, who had no real military experience, rise to the rank of Major General so swiftly? It appears that President Davis is concerned about the abilities and more particularly the judgment of Gideon Pillow. Because of the political importance of Tennessee, Pillow's powerful friends pressed for an appointment. Davis would prefer to have appointed Albert Sidney Johnston, but Johnston was in California and looking forward to a long trip from California to the east, and it could be interrupted by federal agents and the like. Therefore, as Davis mulled the problem, a letter showed up written by Polk suggesting that Johnston was the perfect man for the West, which of course mirrored Davis's own opinion, and there's no way to get quicker to Jefferson Davis's heart than to say something he already agrees with. But he also offered his own services, however Davis might choose to use them. Davis now had his answer. Pillow became a brigadier general, and Leonidas Polk became the bishop general as a major general commissioned in the Confederate Army. Quite a gap from second lieutenant to major general in less than 6 months of active service. A real skyrocketing military career. When Polk left the Virginia capital after being officially promoted to major general, a well-wisher stepped up to him to congratulate him, and Polk characteristically responded, quote, "I do not consider it a promotion. The highest office on this earth is a bishop in the Church of God," unquote. This caused the onlooker to exclaim in surprise, "What, you a bishop throw off the gown for the sword?" unquote. Polk placidly replied, "No, sir, I buckle the sword over the gown," unquote. And indeed, you can see in the famous painting, which is on our marker here, the uniform and the sword are there, and the painting is called "The Sword Over the Gown." He did not resign his bishopric, of course. He continued to serve as a bishop and was active in the church for the remainder of his life. He famously married General John Hunt Morgan in Murfreesboro, and he conducted frequent religious programs for Confederate soldiers. In fact, his last day on earth, here on the mountain. I will talk about it in a little bit, but he was working as a missionary right here on the mountain on his last hours. His new command included Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers, which was wise since the federal invasion was very likely to utilize these waterways because the Confederates had no answering military Navy force, and the Federals did. And Polk's experience as missionary bishop of the Southwest meant he was familiar with the area and its people. But one person he was not familiar with was Gideon Pillow. Pillow was incensed and began to bicker with Polk in a pattern that became all too familiar in Confederate military operations. About this time, Polk reviewed and approved 2 ironclads to be constructed in New Orleans. These were very forward-thinking because the ironclads were virtually the atomic weapon of the 1860s. And the Confederates were at the forefront of ironclad construction, even though we did not have the kind of industrial complex that could be expected to bring these vessels to fruition. Neither of the ships were able to be completed by the time the federal invasion of New Orleans came, and they were not completely ineffective, but unfortunately they were scuttled after the Union victory. I'll talk also very briefly on Kentucky neutrality. Both sides were walking very warily. If you're familiar, Kentucky announced they were going to remain neutral. If it remained neutral, it would be a block to federal troops heading into Tennessee or other points south. Missouri seemed like a particularly fertile field of action. They'd already had fighting started there, but the Kentucky General Assembly had passed a resolution expressing profound regret at the efforts to coerce the seceded states. The legislature further warned that whenever the authorities of those states shall send armed forces to the South for the purposes indicated in said resolutions, that is, to be coerced back into the Union, the people of Kentucky, united with their brethren of the South, will as one man resist the invasion of the soil of the South at all hazards and to the last extremity, unquote. The resolution passed 87-6. After Fort Sumter had fallen, Governor Magoffin stated, quote, "Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states," unquote. Just retired United States Senator John J. Crittenden, author of the famed Crittenden Resolutions, which suggested division of public property on the line of 36 degrees, suggested an armed neutrality by Kentucky to bar the passage of troops from either north or south and force them to bypass the bluegrass state. If Kentucky and other border states had provided a buffer between the Confederacy and the Union, and blood was not shed, could things be adjusted, was Crittenden's concern. Publicly, almost all Kentuckians agreed with his stance, but other forces were covertly at work. Lincoln had some agents working in Kentucky. They were sending arms in Kentucky. They were secretly training, and they were called the Lincoln Rifles, unquote. At the time, Southern sympathizers trusted the assurances of the Unionist forces and permitted them to dominate the elected convention that would hopefully signal their pacific intentions to their brothers in the North. This convention endorsed all that had been done by the governor and the General Assembly. A call for union was issued, but the provision of troops to Lincoln was refused. The Kentucky House of Representatives passed a similar resolution on May 16, 1861 by a vote of 89-4. The secret organizations were, of course, covert during this time. So Governor Magoffin queried Lincoln about the reports of their armed Union men training just a few miles from the capital. Quote, "Honest," unquote, Abe responded the following. 1, he lacked full and precise knowledge of federal military forces in Kentucky and believed any such actions were just the actions of Union-loving citizens in Kentucky. Spontaneous. He didn't know anything about it, even though he'd sent 15 or 20,000 rifles into Kentucky secretly. And although he had sent several agents into Kentucky to organize them secretly. Only the governor seems to be opposed to these actions, well, ignoring what the General Assembly and the conventions had voted. 3, it's popular with the people, not so. And 4, I refuse to remove any troops that might happen to be in Kentucky. So next they organized 3 regiments of infantry and 1 of cavalry. During this time there were other warning signs. Senator Breckinridge went to see Lincoln, and he suggested that a national and representative cabinet consisting of 3 Southern men of good character and 4 moderate Republicans should be formed. What was Lincoln's response to Breckinridge? Quote, "Does any man think I will take my bosom an enemy?" Unquote. When Breckinridge took exception to this language, Lincoln backed down, saying, "Well, I mean any man who voted against me," unquote, which of course shows you anybody who voted against Lincoln is an enemy. Breckinridge continued to press the war measures, oppose the war measures of the Lincoln administration while he was a senator, and then he finally wound up leaving the United States Senate and going back to Kentucky. But an unfortunate episode of which General Polk takes an unfortunate role in is on September 3rd and 4th, he'd gotten reports that the Federal Army in Missouri was going to invade Kentucky, and he decided that he would take Columbus, Kentucky as a strategic post. He was correct. Ulysses S. Grant was planning to invade Kentucky. But the Federals entered the state 2 days after Polk entered the state of Kentucky, and the Union men were able to convince the Kentuckians that Confederates were the aggressors, just as the bombardment of Fort Sumter was set off by the reports of resupply to Fort Sumter. So the legislature, in conformance with what they had done before, voted to expel the Southern troops as the invaders. So regrettably, that was General Polk's biggest role in the war, was to drive Kentucky into the hands of the Union. But let's say something in his defense as well. The problem with Kentucky was that Polk was correct. The Federals were coming in. And if he was not to invade Kentucky, Jefferson Davis should have made that clear to him. That was the objection he had to Gideon Pillow being in command. But he never did tell this to Polk, apparently thinking Polk would figure this out on himself. So that was an unfortunate thing, which I think can be shared between Polk and Davis on that. It cut the Confederacy off from all the wonderful horses in the bluegrass country of Kentucky, and it was a very disastrous thing. Kentucky raised more men for the North than they did for the South, and that was an unfortunate, very unfortunate thing for the South. I'll just touch on a couple other episodes in Polk's career. For example, in Perryville, his wing was the main attacking force on the Army of Ohio under Buell. Polk was hesitant to attack, but General Frank Cheatham, shall we say a more worldly officer than Bishop Polk, rode up to his troops in rather profane language, which was noted by General Cheatham. He said, "Where to send the Yankees?" with no uncertain references. The men in the line looked at Bishop Polk sitting next to Cheatham for some response, expecting the bishop to say something, and he did. He says, "Do as General Cheatham says, boys. Do as General Cheatham says." Polk was then later seated on a horse, and a Federal brigadier general galloped up to him. Polk was wearing a blue cape, as many Confederates would wear, remnants of Yankee uniforms. He said, "Where should I place my men?" "There's some mistake in this, sir. You are my prisoner," said Polk. Polk produced a pistol and took him under custody. Later that day, Polk himself made the same mistake. He rode up to a Federal brigade and ordered them to stop firing on a Confederate formation. The confused officer, since Polk was still wearing his blue cloak, began to obey, but said, "Who are you, sir?" And Polk, looking now more closely at the uniform, said, "I'll show you who I am." And he decided he needed to bluff it out. He rode along the Federal line saying, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" and then turned and raced for the Confederate lines again, escaping. They left the Federals completely befuddled, and he got back to the Confederate lines and ordered them to open up on these Yankees who were not sure what to do, and it was a fairly bad moment for our boys in blue, as shall we say. Now, Polk's wing did win a tactical victory over the Federals, and Kirby Smith came over to Braxton Bragg and said, "You need to follow up immediately on this victory." And Bragg said, "I will do it, sir, I will do it," and immediately retreated. Braxton explained later that the bad news of Lee's failure at Sharpsburg and the defeat at Corinth had forced him to retire. Smith, General Hardee, and the Bishop General were appalled. And this may be said to be the beginning of the bad relationships between Polk and the other generals and Braxton Bragg. After the Confederate failure in the Kentucky campaign, the influence of Polk could be felt, and what can only be described as a cabal of almost every Confederate commander against Bragg. Some of the pro-Bragg historians ascribe this to Polk's powerful personality. I don't think we can leave the personality of Braxton Bragg out of that consideration either. It was a serious issue for Jefferson Davis. At this time, Polk was elevated on October 11, 1862 to the rank of lieutenant general, making him second only to James Longstreet in this rank. The Army of the Mississippi was renamed the Army of Tennessee, and Polk became the First Corps commander. But his own war with Braxton Bragg continued to simmer along. For example, General Cheatham said he would never serve under Bragg again. Breckinridge wanted to challenge Bragg to a duel, and General Forrest made several comments about how he would kill Braxton Bragg before he'd serve under him again. Longstreet said of Bragg, quote, "Nothing but the hand of God can save us or help us as long as we have our present commander," unquote. So, on to glory. Bragg then responded to this as identifying Polk as his main enemy by removing him and shipping him to Atlanta, and then Davis sent him on to Mississippi to take effective command of Mississippi, East Louisiana, and Alabama. And Joe Johnson was sent to replace Bragg. But Polk could not control Sherman's men because he had to protect everything. Sherman could concentrate in small areas, so the raidings in that area continued without success. So after a time, of course, Polk, now second in command to Johnson, with 20,000 men, came back to Georgia to help the struggle here in Georgia. While here, he provided both military and ecclesiastical services and baptized General Hood and then General Johnston. Thus we approached near the end of Polk's service to the Confederate Army and the Southern people. Right here on the summit of Pine Mountain, on a small slope a little north of Kennesaw Mountain, William Tecumseh Sherman, as I mentioned before, observed some, quote, saucy, unquote, rebels and ordered the Indiana artillery to fire on them. The day before, General Pat Cleburne had briefly stood here, and immediately the artillery opened fire on him. And so the group of officers that Sherman had observed that morning were the commander of the Army of Tennessee, Joseph E. Johnston, General William Hardee, and the Bishop General Leonidas Polk. As the three generals scampered for cover, Polk, a man of considerable girth and dignity, less swiftly than the other two, he stopped and turned around for one last look. Unfortunately, it was a last look, as a 3-inch Hotchkiss shell struck him in the chest. The shell fire killed him almost instantly. Johnston and Hardee were crushed with grief. Found in his jacket was a religious tract autographed for each of the generals. It was now stained with his blood. That night, depressed Confederates defected and deserted from the Confederate Army. And so the Federals found out that the Bishop General was no more on this earth. Today, on this private property owned by the Bentley family, the shaft stands that the SCV has had cleaned and restored with our tag funds. It marks the exact spot where the Bishop General met his maker. When this monument was dedicated in 1902, a small child was up here and saw a grizzled veteran in tattered gray weeping at the ceremony. The grizzled man in gray explained to the child that he was sitting exactly where he'd sat on June 14, 1864, which is in this area where our honor guard stands. And the fatal 3-inch Hotchkiss shell struck the Bishop General. They got it exactly right. That is the marker exactly where General Polk fell. That child shared the story with an old man, went an old man to the present owner of the then present owner of the property, Mr. Fred D. Bentley Senior, who has shared it with us, and so I now pass that legacy on to you folks. Sam Watkins, the high private in the rear ranks of the Company H fame, recorded his grief in his wonderful memoir, which I cannot recommend highly enough to any of you. When he died in 1901, as an aside, Sam Watkins was laid to rest by members of the Leonidas Polk bivouac of the United Confederate Veterans. But Watkins wrote, quote, "My pen and ability are inadequate to the task of doing his memory justice. Every private soldier loved him. Second to Stonewall Jackson, his loss was the greatest the South ever sustained. When I saw him there dead, I felt as if I'd lost a friend whom I have ever loved and respected. And the South had lost one of her best and greatest generals," unquote. His soldierly, we have a 29-minute problem here on this recording. It has to be restarted. Otherwise, these wonderful words will be lost forever. His soldiers ever loved him and honored him. They called him, quote, Bishop Polk, and Bishop Polk was ever a favorite with the Army. When any position was held, and it was known that Bishop Polk was there, we knew that all was well, said Watkins. Now Sherman, by contrast, wired Pollock and said, quote, "We killed Bishop Polk yesterday and made good progress today," unquote. Pretty terse announcement. Jefferson Davis, writing a generation after Polk's death, opined, quote, "Our Army, our country, and mankind at large sustained an irreparable loss in the death of that noble Christian and soldier, Lieutenant General Polk. Since the calamitous fall of General Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh and of Thomas J. Jackson at Chancellorsville, the country sustained no heavier blow than in the death of General Polk," unquote. I don't know how Jackson got overlooked in that, but, anyway. Henry Watterson, an aide to Polk, later recalled, quote, "In battle, he was a daring old man, and his heart in the fray, his best faith on the result. He was proverbial for getting into hot places, unquote, and they seemed to go along a line of fire like children through the fiery furnace, and untouched. The English military observer, Colonel Arthur J.L. Freemantle, left this word on a portrait of Polk, finding him a, quote, a good-looking man, affable, tall, upright, looking much more like a soldier than a clergyman, unquote. But as both a churchman and a general, Polk, while not possessed of the acumen of Robert E. Lee, then again, who was, won the confidence and the affection of his soldiers, a very important thing. So when people criticize Polk for the fact that maybe he was not up to the mark of some people like Lee, who've been professional soldiers all their lives, he was a political general. West Point officers were not well regarded by Confederate rank and file. Military discipline was somewhat lacking on both sides during the war. A political general was very attuned to the wants and needs of his troops. Political generals were generally not interested in high casualties. Political generals were also useful to recruit more volunteers into the ranks. What shortcomings Polk may have had don't appear to have been any worse than the other political generals. His high standing and reputation, in fact, not only across the South, but in the nation at large, was a positive boon to the Southland. As an example of the usage of political generals, we only need to look at Lincoln's love of such general as Alexander Schimmelpfennig. I know that that's a name that just trips off your tongue. Schimmelpfennig was actually named by Union General-in-Chief Harry Halleck as being one of the officers whose appointment was nothing short of murder. Lincoln laughed off this criticism and said Schimmelpfennig's name alone was worth a German regiment. In much the same way, Polk's appointment as Major General by Davis did confer enormous prestige to the Confederate Army. Unlike most political generals, he actually had been trained at West Point, although his service, as I've mentioned, was pretty limited. Nevertheless, he had considerable executive experience as a missionary bishop and bishop. So, when we think about Polk, we need to think about a man who has given his all. He did what he felt was honorable, just to the best of his abilities. The moral arguments against him as a bishop, I think I have rebutted. Bishops in battle were certainly not unknown in the Christian church. So, one of the things about Polk, which we might mention here, a little touch, is that when he was in Maury County, Tennessee, the church built on the property donated by Polk was widely admired. In fact, General Patrick Cleburne, for example, viewing the church said, quote, "It's almost worth to be dying to be buried in such a beautiful place," unquote. A few days later, Cleburne was laid to rest in the churchyard after the Battle of Franklin. The Bishop General and other Confederates will be pleased, maybe even surprised, to know that we think of them today over a century and a half later. Indeed, the ancient Greeks believed that the soul never died as long as someone remembered them. We must keep in mind that Leonidas Polk, like his Spartan namesake at Thermopylae, did not fight for a marker like this. Indeed, in Polk's case, we know he did not want to die in combat because he had big plans for the post-war independent South. Patton's comments about making someone else die for their country comes to mind. Polk sought to survive the war and continue what he saw his life's work, which was education and the church. But like many, if not practically all Southerners, the pressure of events had other plans for him and his career. He fought for us. He didn't fight for honor or markers or memorials. He fought for a better world for us. He sought to elevate our morals, educate our minds, and ensure liberty for an independent Southland. And herein is the lesson of our Confederate ancestors. Just as General Polk did, just as they did, we need to dedicate our lives and our energies to those who come next, those who are born today and those who are unborn. Our Confederate ancestors, being human, made mistakes. We should learn from those mistakes and profit thereby. After all, the cost of some of these mistakes has been enormous. But in their lives, the lives of Leonidas Polk, for example, is rich with a heritage of honor. Polk and other Confederate ancestors' concern for us today is evident in their actions and their sacrifices. And we would be deeply unworthy if we did not recall them, study them, learn from them, and improve on them. And I thank you for being here today, and I hope that you will go forward and follow the charge of General Stephen D. Lee. Good afternoon. Good morning.
At the right oblique. Straight it. Hey! Hey! Quick, come up. Hold on. Whoa. come to the ready when you're late. Hey! Recover! Hold! Load! Hey! Huh! Recover! Hold! Shoulder! Hold! Release!
A few events come up that I couldn't control. Before closing, I would like to recognize a couple of dignitaries if haven't been done. We have our division commander, Tim Pilgrim. I don't see Michael Reiser. Oh, there he is. Yeah, brigade commander. And Mr. John Evans is with us, I understand?
No.
No?
No. Oh, is it?
Where?
Oh, he's hiding.
Oh,
He's not in his usual garb.
I couldn't find you back there. I'd like to thank him for his invaluable assistance over the years. Melvin Dishon lives on the street over here, promoting his interest in promoting this site and
Terry,
providing
have
tours.
the second brigade commander, Michael Dean.
Michael Dean? Oh, where are you over there? Ah, thank you. All right, let's see. Of course, we got the 43 Georgia reenactors, and I understand the 18th Alabama's here. They make it? No? Okay. They called me and asked if they could attend, and I told them we'd be glad to have them. Okay. Melvin, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Just want to welcome everyone to Pine Mountain. And Pine Mountain's the little mountain with the big history.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Okay. Well, in closing, I'd like to thank each of you for taking the time to be here with us this morning as we commemorate General Polk. And as we conduct the service each year, your family, friends, all invited to join us next year. We close by singing Dixie, retiring the covers, and close with the benediction. Okay.
You want to sing Dixie?
Why not? Let's go for it. You want to lead us?
Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born, early on when frosty morn. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. For I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Hey!
Okay, David, if you'd give some benediction, please.
We pray that the Bentley family allows us to come back again next year. We really had a hard time coming up here the last 3 years. Let us all pray now. We thank you, Heavenly Father, that this group of men are here today, and women, to honor the bishop. Lord, as they get ready to go home today, pray you'll bless a safe trip for them home. Pray, Heavenly Father, that we can be here again, all together again, in one accord. Pray, Lord, that we don't forget our ancestors and the terrible conditions they had and what they fought for. I just wish that more people just knew what we stand for and not slavery. That's a terrible thing. And times have changed, and pray, Heavenly Father, that you'll bless us as we go our way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen.